Good morning, friends. I'm Steve Clouse, the lead pastor here. It's my honor to be with you this morning and to deliver today's message. It is a beautiful day out today, is it not? I'm filled with the hope of spring training specifically. So far, my Chicago Cubs have not lost a single game. Not one. We've tied half of them and won the other half of them, but long history and understanding of the Chicago Cubs has taught me that although we are on a mountaintop at the present, we will not stay there. Things will not look quite so great. Today, we're going to talk about our faith journey that we have as followers of Jesus Christ and what it is like for us when we are in the valleys, when we are not on the mountaintop of every part of our existence. I'd like to invite you to turn with me to your scriptures, which are on the front of your worship folder. Let us read together from Psalm 129. Keep me down. Their plowmen plowed long furrows up and down my back. And Psalm 130, verses 5 through 8, which reads, I pray to God, my life a prayer, and wait what he'll say and do. My life's on the line before God, my Lord, waiting and watching until morning. Waiting and watching until morning. O Israel, wait and watch for God. With God's arrival comes love. With God's arrival comes generous redemption. No doubt about it, he'll redeem Israel. He'll buy back Israel from captivity and sin. And the third verse of Psalm 131, wait Israel for God. Wait with hope. Hope now and hope always. This is the word of God for the people of God. Today is the very last leg of our pre-Lenten sermon series, which has been focused on the Songs of Ascent. For those of you who have missed the last few weeks of worship, the Songs of Ascent are songs of travel. Psalms 120 through 134 or 5 were all written as songs to be sung by God's people as they made their way to Jerusalem for worship. Whether they traveled across town to the temple or from far away from Jerusalem, God's people prepared for worship by singing. So they sang these songs on their way to church. Now, in the Clouse house where I was raised as a little boy, it was not unusual for us to walk to church on a beautiful sunny day like today. However, there was a point of demarcation that we all needed to heed on our journey to church. Whether we walked or drove the car, we knew that by the time we reached East Hubbard Avenue, we had to shape up. At that point, it was time to stop whining, stop goofing off, stop fighting with our siblings in the back seat of the Country Squire station wagon, to shape up so that we did not embarrass our parents when we reached the church parking lot. That was aided along by every so often an occasional "so help me" coming from the front seat of the Country Squire station wagon. Maybe you can relate. I'm sure none of your children ever acted up on the way to church, but this psalm is a song of these songs. These three that we will look at are songs by people who are in distress, God's people, families who are experiencing angst. The psalmist writes with vivid language to tell God and his travel companions singing these songs on their way to worship about their trouble. They say things like, "The bottom has fallen out of my life, O God," in Psalm 130. Or, "My enemies are tearing up my body with a sharp plow blade. They're plowing up my back." Perhaps these songs that were sung on certain legs of the journey to Jerusalem were sung as a way to remind God's people to trust and to pull themselves together before they too reach the parking lot ready for worship. Now, all joking aside, the real existential issue in these Psalms is the issue of human suffering. These aren't merely the expressions of typical existential angst from your average Joe person. These are not the groanings and moanings of people who have a little bit of difficulty. These are songs of God's people who are bringing their cares and their concerns to the God who protects their very lives. And these kinds of psalms may seem even a little foreign to us today because we often do not acknowledge suffering as a part of the spiritual journey for followers of God in the 21st century. The author of our book study has this to say about Americans and Christianity and suffering. He says, "We live in a time when everyone's goal is to be perpetually happy and healthy, constantly healthy. If any of us fails to live up to the standards that are advertised as normative of being healthy and happy, we are labeled as a problem to be solved. And a host of well-intentioned people will rush to try out various cures on us. Or we are looked on as an enigma to be unraveled, in which case we are subjected to endless discussions. Our lives are examined by researchers zealous for the clue that will account for our lack of health and happiness." Now, in my opinion, that mindset is not helping to solve the problem of dealing with human suffering. It actually amplifies our suffering. So what can we learn from these ancient singers and poets about how to deal with suffering and the grief and the loss that accompany it? Well, first, we must understand something about the context in which these songs were written and see how they can be applied to our own experience of God. Most of the worship of God's people that took place in ancient times happened in a tabernacle or a temple, and it was the worship of sacrifices. People would bring livestock, produce, offerings from their hunts, and other things not unlike the flowers that we see at our altar. They would bring them to the priests, and God would receive them at the altar of the Lord. Now, we don't have many specific examples about the liturgy or the order of service for these kinds of sacrificial services. And fortunately, we've not had many songs about those kinds of grisly animal sacrifices at the altar preserved. But God was very clear about his expectations. God expected to be honored with these sacrifices to atone for the sin of God's people. And God was crystal clear that obeying God's commands would bring blessing, and sinning against God's commands would bring suffering, even curses. Deuteronomy 28 lays out this covenant. It says, "If you faithfully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all of his commands I give you today, the Lord will set you high above the nations of all the earth. These blessings will come to you and accompany you if you obey the Lord. The fruit of your womb will be blessed, the crops of your land and the young of your livestock, the calves and herds and lambs of your flocks will be blessed. Your basket and your kneading trough will be blessed. You will be blessed when you come in and go out. The Lord will grant that the enemies who rise up against you will be defeated before you. They will come at you from one direction, but flee scattering in 7 directions." So God promised blessing for those who obeyed and followed God's commands, and blessing for those who brought sacrifices to atone for their sin. But the opposite was also true. God promised that if people forgot to offer sacrifices, if they sinned against God's commands, then their cities and towns would wither, their crops would fail, their children would be few and weak, and their enemies would triumph over them. And so in the time that these Psalms are written, God's people lived in a covenant relationship that appeared to be almost merit-based. In fact, it depicted a very kind of cause and effect dynamic between God's people and the worship of the God of Israel. And over the centuries, these psalm writers created the best poems, and these holy songwriters collected and curated and added to the book of Scripture psalms like Psalm 129 and 130 and 131. They were used in worship in some of the same ways that we use music and poetry today. God's people processed into worship to these songs. They sang them in worship. They retold them to each other at home around the cooking fire. And some of the commentators that I read for this week said that these psalms actually allow space for people to address the issue of suffering and injustice apart from the cause and effect of God's covenant relationship with them, apart from the effects of sin or merit before God. The Psalms, like the ones we read today, create a safe place to call a time out with God. Walter Brueggemann says that many of these kinds of psalms, like ours today, express a disorientation between God and God's people. Psalm 129, 30, and 131 allow God's followers a safe space to say to God, God, please help. The world is not as it should be, and it's not my fault. Dr. Eugene Peterson says, these are the true great realities of Psalms. Suffering is real and God is real. Suffering is a mark of our human authenticity, and God is the proof of our essential and eternal humanity. That's the great benefit of these 3 songs of travel that we read today. They allow us a space where we can get real with God, and we can be real with ourselves. We don't have to carry on or pretend that our life on earth is just one big fun fair of sunshine and rainbows and love songs. We can get real with ourselves, acknowledging that we will suffer at times in this life, but we can also stay connected to God and be honest with God. We can say things to our Creator like, help, where are you? The world is in chaos. The bottom has fallen out of my life. We can tell God that our enemies are carving up our lives like a plowed field. They are demanding to know what we accomplished this last week, to justify our existence by a 5-point bullet-pointed email asking us what we do of value. We can tell God that the cancer, that the stress, the trauma, the disease, and the disorder, and the suffering that we're experiencing, they're not fair, they're not just, they're not deserved. And the Psalms also offer us a safe space for God to call a time out with us. These songs of faith create a space for the holy imagination of God's people to share God's responses to our suffering. God says things to us like, "O Israel, wait and watch for God." With God's arrival comes love. With God's arrival comes generous redemption. Words like these are really a paraphrased answer to the rants and the recriminations in our interaction with God through the Psalms. God is saying to us, those trials are not my punishment for you. I did not cause the cancer, the stress, the trauma, the disease, and the disorder or the suffering. God is saying to us, you are right. Those trials may not be fair. They are not just. They are undeserved. But God is saying to us, I hear you. I am with you. I will be your hope and your protector. You are still my beloved, and I still call you by name. That safe space created by the Psalms like these for interaction with God is something that is impossible for non-believers to understand. If you pick up your phone or your computer and take a quick and casual glance at the internet or social media, you'll easily be put in touch with people who have strong opinions about human suffering and God. These so-called experts will share their opinion that trusting in an unseen and all-powerful being to be benevolent and just is just preposterous in a world filled with suffering. I heard one such expert this week say that God either is not capable of interrupting human suffering or really just doesn't care. But these explanations always omit the cause and effect relationship between humanity and injustice. We may unleash all sorts of tragedies on ourselves, undeserved or not, as we exercise the free will that God created us with. We create the plastic that releases the toxic chemicals that incubate diseases, and then we turn and blame God for not stopping that disease. So, in a world with so much paradoxical information, how then do we live as people who believe in God and are on a spiritual journey? I would offer this explanation. A Christian is a person who decides to face and live through suffering. If we do not make that decision, we are endangered on every side. A man or woman of faith who fails to acknowledge and deal with human suffering becomes either a cynic or a melancholic or someone on suicide watch. And because I don't want my congregation to be filled with cynics or melancholics or people on suicide watch, I think it's incumbent on me to explain how we live as Christians through suffering. First, we wait on God and we ask for God's deliverance. These words are at the center of our discipleship relationship with God. Wait is the instruction we receive in Psalm 130 and 131. The poets said it this way: "Wait, O Israel, for God. Wait with hope. Hope now and hope always." Waiting requires us to sustain our belief and our trust in God's care and provision. It doesn't mean that we do nothing. It's not fatalistic resignation. It means going about our assigned task, believing that God will provide both the conclusion to our suffering and some meaning in it. And as Psalm 131 says, we wait for God's protection and deliverance and salvation like a watchman looks for the dawn, knowing that it has always come before, because it always will. I can say with assurance that God's deliverance has always arrived just as the dawn does after the night. Now, the second part of our discipleship program from Psalms 129 through 131 is to watch, to seek, to look for God. We have to be vigilant in looking for God, seeking out where God is at work, and being willing to join God there. Psalm 129 provides us with assurance that if we look for God's supportive care, we will find it. It says God won't put up with our oppression. He sticks with us. I take great comfort in those words. God will not put up with our sufferings forever. He will stick by us. And waiting and watching add up to hope in the calculus of our faith. But there's one other audience that is hidden within these strange songs of faith that we read. And that audience is the crucial part of God's deliverance and hope. That is the audience of the congregation to each other. Just as we sing songs of faith to each other, so they sang these psalms to each other. They sang them on their way to the temple, on their road to Jerusalem, and around the campfires in their villages. And so in singing, the writer of Psalm 130 says that the bottom has fallen out of his life. That meant every year people would sing songs like this, and they would look at each other in real time and make a knowing glance, knowing that maybe the bottom had actually fallen out of the life of their neighbor or their friend or their relative. You see, friends, you can't sit across a table or across a pew from someone who is suffering publicly and just ignore it. Part of our journey as Christian disciples is that when we sing and read songs like this, we walk together as comrades. We reach out to acknowledge and alleviate the suffering of the people around us. That means that you and I are a part of God's program of deliverance and hope. We are meant to shoulder the burden for each other, to carry the load. And this is where I need your help as the pastor of this church. The burdens of Liberty United Methodist Church and our community are so great. They are far too many for just one person. Every week we are flooded with prayer requests, with new information about the suffering of our congregation. Each week, the number of congregational conversations I have with people who are highly anxious grows. But the capacity that I have to offer connection to my fellow human beings around me and to help and to hope with them is limited. I want to gather all of these people under the shadow of my wings like a mother hen covers her chicks, but I find that I have the sad, small, childlike arms of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. There's not nearly enough space just under the covering of my wings. So friends, we need more people involved in caring for each other, caring for our community outside of the walls of our church. We need more people involved in our care ministries at church. My urgent plea to you is to consider how you could alleviate the suffering of others by watching and waiting along with them. You could be the hopeful presence that makes God's salvation real for someone else.